Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are opening up a piece of history that, it's usually read as a pretty straightforward tale, spiritual succession, right?
Sure.
The story of the corrupt priest Eli and the rising prophet Samuel. But honestly, that reading, it's just far too thin. What we actually have in front of us, when you dig into the sources, it's not just a few chapters in 1 Samuel. It's really a 2,000-year debate, a huge one, about leadership ethics, about systemic failure, and, well, the very nature of divine justice.
That's absolutely right. Our deep dive today is into 1 Samuel, chapters 2, verse 12, right through to chapter 4, verse 1. And like you said, we aren't just summarizing the text. That's not the goal. Our mission here is to tell one integrated story. The story of the downfall of the priestly house of Eli and, of course, the rise of Samuel that follows. And to do that, we'll be constantly weaving in these different lenses the historical context, the textual variations, the philosophical insights used by, sages, critics, philosophers across literally 2 millennia, all trying to understand exactly why this crisis happened.
Right, so we're starting way back, Iron Age. We need to set the scene at Shiloh. And archaeology, at Pil Shiloh, Kirvat Sealand, it confirms this wasn't just some random meeting spot. No, it was a major cultic center. Big deal during the Iron Cedar period. This was the place, the semi-permanent sanctuary where the Ark of the Covenant actually resided.
Yeah.
So this whole period, it represents this really pivotal transition, moving away from the mobile tabernacle, the one from the wilderness wanderings, into a fixed central religious precinct.
And it's right there in that fixed precinct that you see institutional failure really start to set in. But here's something crucial you need to grasp right from the start. This narrative in Samuel, it's not just reporting history like a neutral observer. Oh no, it's being highly selective. It's structured, it's edited very deliberately by what scholars call the Deuteronomistic history, the DTRH editors. And they were likely working much later, probably during the exile or maybe the early post-exilic period.
Okay, so this is basically, it's a theological argument dressed up as history. So what was their agenda? What were they trying to argue?
Their agenda, fundamentally, was to articulate a theological concern that, well, it justified a major regime change, a transfer of power. They're arguing that the moral failure of Eli's leadership, which was hereditary, institutional, the old guard, that this failure demanded the transfer of sacred authority. Authority had to move to someone new, someone charismatic, ethically rigorous, and that someone was the prophet Samuel. So the core tension, the thing that shapes the whole story, and honestly every commentary written about it since, is this clash. Institutional corruption versus prophetic purity.
Got it. So as we go through this, we'll be shifting constantly. We'll look at what the text says happened, the sort of narrative facts. Then we'll ask why those DTRH editors needed it to happen that way, their theological angle. We'll also touch on how, textual variations, looking at the Hebrew Masoretic text versus the Greek Septuagint, even the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran, how they frame it slightly differently. And finally, we layer in these incredible, sometimes challenging insights from medieval jurists like Rambam, Maimonides, philosophers like Ibn Ezra, right up to 20th century thinkers like Heschel. It's definitely a dense stack of interpretation, but weaving it together like this, it might just be the ultimate shortcut to really getting this story.
Okay, let's dive into that integrated story then, starting with the key players on the stage at Shiloh. First, you've got Eli. He's the elderly high priest, also serving as a judge. He represents the established authority, even if it's kind of fading by this point. Then you have his 2 sons, Hofni and Pinchas. They're the ones actually doing the priestly duties day to day in the cult. And then sort of off to the side, there's the young boy Samuel. He's been dedicated to service there. He represents purity, innocence, receptivity, and ultimately the future authority.
And the narrative doesn't waste any time, does it? It gets right down to business, detailing these specific, frankly, predatory abuses by Eli's sons, verses 12 to 17 in chapter 2 and verse 22. And this isn't some abstract idea of corruption. No, it's tangible. It's deeply transactional.
Yeah.
You can almost picture it.
Absolutely. It starts with what we'd call cultic and economic abuse. This is really where the rot begins to show. See, the rules around sacrifice, they were meticulous, very specific about dividing the portions of the animal. Certain parts were offered up to God, usually the fat, considered the best part. Certain parts belonged to the priests, that was their sustenance, and other parts went back to the worshiper for a communal meal. But Hofni and Pinchas, they were completely exploiting this system, just for their own personal, immediate gratification.
They weren't just taking their share, they were jumping the queue. They were actively seizing stuff that wasn't theirs yet.
Exactly. The text is quite graphic. They were demanding raw meat. Before the fat, the symbolic portion belonging to God was even properly offered up on the altar. And our sources, they make a point of describing this tool they used, a large three-pronged fork. They just plunge it into the pot where the sacrifices were cooking and grab whatever came up. This fork-first mentality. Now, the DTRH editors, the ones shaping this story, they frame this abuse very seriously. It's not just, minor theft or some kind of marketplace friction. No, they present it as a severe legal trespass and, even more importantly, a theological betrayal. They were corrupting the ziva, the sacrifice itself. Think about it. They were rendering the whole act of worship almost meaningless for the poor pilgrim who brought the offering. The very steward of the offering was preying on the people he was supposed to serve.
Wow. So when the custodians of the system, the priests themselves, start dismantling the rules for their own gain, I mean, the covenant, that relationship with God, it's essentially breached right there. That kind of corruption coming from within the sanctuary, it feels like an existential threat to the whole community's connection to the divine.
Precisely. And the abuse, it seems, was institutionalized. It wasn't just limited to the cultic economics, grabbing meat. The text also charges them quite bluntly with sexual misconduct. It says they lay with the women serving at the sanctuary's entrance. That's 1 Samuel 2, verse 22.
Okay, at this point, the sexual misconduct charge, this is where the story hits its first really major interpretive twist, isn't it? This radical defense that comes centuries later from the Talmudic sages.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting, as you say. You have the Talmudic sages, these great rabbis of the Amoraic period, roughly 200 to 300 CE. They looked at these charges, particularly the one about sexual misconduct, and they found it almost unbearable, an unacceptable stain on the honor of Israel's foundational leaders.
They just couldn't accept it. They couldn't believe the sons of the high priest would commit such a profound violation of sacred space.
Exactly that. They felt a deep need to protect the integrity of their historical lineage. So they employed this really sophisticated interpretive method. It's often called legal agadic harmonization. Basically, they aim to defend these figures through a very close, almost lawyerly, and deliberately charitable rereading of the text. And the most radical expression of this view, it's preserved right there in the Talmud Tractate Shabbat, page 55b. You have major figures like Rav Narf, Rabbi Elazar, Res Lakish, declaring quite astonishingly, whoever says the sons of Eli sinned in that way is mistaken.
Wait a minute, how can they possibly say that?
Yeah.
The Bible seems so explicit. So what do they redefine the sin to be, if not sexual misconduct?
Okay, this is the clever part. They recast the phrase lying with the women. They didn't take it literally as sexual acts. Instead, they interpreted it as procedural and administrative abuse. The argument went something like this. The son's sin was causing undue delay and distress for the women who came to bring their offerings. Maybe the sons were lazy or inefficient or just arrogant in their duties, making these women wait unnecessarily long at the sanctuary entrance. Perhaps they even had to postpone their required offerings. So it's still a serious procedural violation. It still degrades the cult, makes worship difficult, shows disrespect. But, and this is the crucial move, it spares the sons the ultimate devastating charge of sexual crime within the sacred precinct.
Huh. So the original crime, as written, sounds like an existential threat. Defiling the sacred space, abusing the vulnerable staff, possibly demanding capital punishment under the law. But the Talmudic reading, it transforms it. It becomes a grave procedural offense, a massive failure of public trust and priestly duty, maybe even bad manners on a grand scale, but not sexual defilement. Is that what you meant by judging leaders with maximal textual charity, giving them the absolute benefit of the doubt even against the plain sense?
That phrase perfectly captures their approach. They're trying to harmonize the biblical account, which is often brutally honest about flawed human leaders, with their ideal of, near flawless leadership in Israel's past.
Yeah.
Even with this procedural shift, though, the fundamental result remains the same. The sons did degrade the cult. They did alienate the worshipers, and this did lead to the justified transfer of authority to Samuel. That part isn't disputed. But this reinterpretation allows the sages to maintain a certain dignity for the historical institutions of Israel, even while acknowledging a serious failure. It's a fascinating act of moral preservation through reinterpretation. Ultimately, maybe the exact nature of the crime isn't the main point for them. The point is the institution failed to serve the pilgrim properly, and that failure had consequences.
Okay, so whether the crime was outright cultic fraud, or this reinterpreted procedural delay, or maybe even the sexual defilement as written, the sins were clearly happening. They were undeniable. But the divine judgment, when it comes, it's delivered not just against the perpetrators, Hofni and Pinchas, it lands squarely on Eli himself. And this throws us right into this profound crisis of accountability, doesn't it?
It really does. Eli's culpability, which is laid out in chapter 2, verse 29, and later confirmed in chapter 3, verse 13, it's primarily one of passive omission, failure to act. I mean, the text is fair. It shows he did verbally rebuke his sons. That's in verses 23 to 25 at chapter 2. He even points out how serious it is to sin directly against the Lord, worse than sinning against another person. But that's where he stopped, just words.
And that becomes the core of the divine charge against him, right? That he honored your sons more than me.
Exactly. That's the devastating line. The charge isn't that Eli committed the sins himself. It's that he failed to use his ultimate authority. He was the high priest and the judge. The top guy failed to use that authority to actively restrain his sons or, crucially, to remove them from their priestly office. He seems to have prioritized, perhaps, familial affection or maybe just maintaining institutional stability over upholding divine honor and basic moral integrity within the sanctuary. It's the omission, the failure of governance, the failure to protect the sanctity of the cult. That becomes his downfall.
Yeah, I can totally see why medieval commentators would latch onto that omission. It immediately turns this ancient story into a timeless lesson about holding public office, about responsibility.
Absolutely. You look at figures like Radak Rabbi David Kimoi, a really important grammarian and interpreter from Provence, active in the 12th and early 13th centuries. Radak really stressed this point. Eli's silence, his inaction in the face of blatant abuse, that silence itself is a sin. And this interpretation lines up perfectly with a broader Talmudic perspective on leadership you find in various places. It's merit, not just lineage or title, that sustains true leadership. When you have the power, the authority to stop abuse, and you choose not to, well, then you become complicit in that abuse. Your inaction speaks volumes.
And this failure of custody, this complicity through inaction, it leads to one of the most chilling theological decrees in the whole narrative. That's 1 Samuel 3, verse 14. The sin of Eli's entire house, his lineage, is declared unatonable by ritual means. The text says it will not be purged with sacrifice or offering forever.
Huh?
Forever.
Yes, that's a truly devastating moment in the story. Think about the implication. If the very system designed for purification, the sacred sacrificial cult that Eli himself oversees, if that system is declared impotent, powerless to purify its own custodians, then what recourse is left? It's like the institution has fundamentally broken its own repair mechanism. The corruption is so deep it can't be fixed by the usual means.
Wow. Okay, this sounds like a moment that's almost custom-made for a rationalist philosopher like Rambam, Maimonides, the great jurist philosopher from the 12th century. How did his sort of philosophical and legal mind process this specific decree, the unatonable sin?
You're right. It aligns perfectly with Rambam's thinking. Maimonides, consistent with his rationalist philosophy throughout his work, he maintained a clear hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, ethics and justice consistently outrank ritual performance, especially when it comes to public matters affecting the community. So for him, the unatonable nature of Eli's sin, it makes perfect sense. Why? Because institutional ethical failure, especially corruption, that directly impacts the public's ability to worship freely and receive justice, it's so fundamentally corrosive, so grave, that the very mechanisms of the cult, the sacrifices and offerings, are rendered powerless to address the rot within its own leadership. You can't use a purely ritual fix for a deep ethical breakdown at the heart of the system. The repair has to come through a different, arguably higher, mechanism. Genuine moral and philosophical change, acts of justice.
Okay, so if sacrifice and offering are ruled out forever, does that mean the house of Eli is just permanently condemned? Is there no possibility of divine mercy, no path back?
But that's where the rabbinic tradition always seeks a way forward, always looks for a path toward teshuvah, repentance, return, repair. And here, another key passage from the Talmud, this time tractate Rosh Hashanah, page 18a, provides this beautiful and absolutely critical clarification. It states, quoting or interpreting that very verse from Samuel, that yes, Eli's house cannot be atoned for by sacrifice or offering, B-U-T. It can be atoned for through Torah and East.
Yes. Usually translated as mercy or loving kindness, covenant loyalty, that kind of act of goodness.
Exactly. And this reframing is brilliant, isn't it? It suggests that the necessary remedy, the fix for this profound cultic failure, must itself be fundamentally ethical and instructional. It demands internal moral transformation achieved through deep study of Torah, God's teaching, and external acts of relational kindness, of East. Not just going through the motions of external ritual performance, it's a profound shift in emphasis. The only way to truly heal a system that was corrupted by greed and neglect is through rigorous ethical engagement and acts of selfless service and kindness.
That completely reframes it. It turns it from just a story of doom and judgment into one of pedagogy, a lesson in what true repair looks like.
Okay, so just before Samuel actually receives his famous call, the narrative does this thing where it sets the spiritual stage. That's 1 Samuel 3, verse 1. It notes significantly, the word of the Lord was scarce in those days. There was no frequent vision, or no vision spread wide, depending on the translation. It feels like the divine connection itself has been damaged, or at least faded.
Yes, that word scarce is critical. But it gets amplified even further in some of the ancient interpretations. Take the late antique Aramaic translation, the Targum Jonathan, probably finalized around the 2nd or 3rd century CE. When it paraphrases 1 Samuel 3.1, it doesn't just say the word was scarce. It says the word of the Lord was hidden.
Hidden, wow. Not just scarce or rare, but actively hidden. That implies an intentional withdrawal, doesn't it? Precisely. It suggests God wasn't just silent, but had deliberately concealed the divine word. And this interpretation makes Samuel's subsequent call, when it finally breaks through, feel like a powerful reversal of that concealment. It intensifies the contrast between the preceding spiritual scarcity, the hiddenness, and the sudden necessary revelation that's about to occur. It signals that prophecy wasn't just fading away due to some natural entropy. No, it was actively withdrawn because the intended recipients, namely the corrupt priests running the show, were deemed unworthy, unfit to receive it. The revelation was waiting perhaps for a pure vessel, someone ready to actually listen.
And that takes us directly then to the moment the silence is finally broken. The setting for Samuel's call, it feels so highly deliberate, doesn't it? That's 1 Samuel 3, verse 3. Samuel, just a boy, was lying down in the temple of the Lord, right there where the Ark of God was. And the timing is key, too. Just before the lamp of God went out. That phrase, the lamp going out, it feels like such a powerful literary cue, signifying this liminal time, this threshold moment, between night and dawn, maybe? When the old order, represented by Eli, is fading, but the new light hasn't fully arrived yet.
Yes, the timing, the specific just before the lamp went out, it absolutely fascinated the more rationalist commentators down through the ages because, well, they were always looking for ways to understand the reception of divine inspiration within a framework that acknowledged natural processes too. You see this with figures like Ibn Ezra, Abraham Ibn Ezra, the great Spanish polymath in the 12th century, and also Ralbag, also known as Gersonides, a major provincial philosopher and astronomer from the 14th century. They both picked up on this timing.
Interesting. What was their rationalist take on it? Why did the pre-dawn timing matter so much to them?
Well, they were deeply interested in the psychological and intellectual conditions that might be conducive to prophecy. They weren't necessarily denying the divine source, but they were exploring how it might be received by the human mind. And they noted that this specific timing, just before dawn, perhaps in the quietest, darkest part of the night, just before the lamp was ritually extinguished, this correlates, in ancient thought, with what was sometimes called the hour of true dreams, or a time of heightened intellectual clarity and receptivity. So for these rationalists, prophecy wasn't just random static. It was often understood as a form of graded intellectual perfection or a heightened state of awareness. And the divine word, they suggested, might be most clearly received under these optimal conditions, conditions of quiet, focus, and perhaps peak mental or spiritual preparedness. In their view, Samuel wasn't just chosen randomly. He was potentially prepared and certainly placed in the optimal setting and mental state to receive this crucial revelation.
Okay, and then the call itself. The Lord calls Samuel 3 times. And this structure, this triadic pattern, and it's especially Samuel's eventual response, it stands in such stark opposition to the predatory actions of Eli's sons we talked about earlier.
Oh, absolutely. This is the literary heart of the entire transition, the pivot point. And the contrast is made almost surgical by the language the text uses. Think back. Eli's sons were defined by their greed, their entitlement, their forceful taking, remember, the fork-first mentality. Samuel's posture is the complete opposite. His availability, his readiness is marked by that repeated, responsive Hebrew word, hineni, which means something like, here I am, or I am present, ready. He makes himself radically available, poised to serve, a direct and deliberate reversal of the entitlement and self-interest displayed by the old guard.
And the ultimate mandate, the core ethic of his new leadership, it's delivered in his final answer.
Yep.
After Eli, realizing it's God calling, finally tells the boy how to respond. Samuel says, speak, for your servant is shemi'ah. Listen.
Shemi'ah, yes. That word is absolutely key. And it means so much more than just passively hearing sound waves. Shemi'ah implies active listening, deep attention, obedience, readiness to respond, ethical attentiveness. It's about being receptive not just with the ears, but with the whole self. You know, the 19th century commentator Malbim, Rabbi Meir Leibush Weiser, he was known for his incredibly detailed, almost hyper-philological analysis of the Hebrew text. He spent a lot of time on this sequence of the triple call.
Right. So how does Malbim use his deep dive into the language, the philology, to sort of deepen the lesson here?
Malbim's insight, looking at every nuance, was that the very repetition, the three calls, and the fact that Samuel needed Eli to teach him the correct response, all of this teaches us precisely how listening is learned. It's not automatic. It's a deliberate cultivation, almost like learning a grammar of ethical receptivity. Samuel starts confused. He doesn't recognize the voice. Eli, the fading leader, still has one crucial role left, to teach the successor how to listen to the divine call. Malbim sees it as didactic. God is actively training the next generation of leadership in this posture of pure receptivity, precisely because the old priesthood had become deafened by its own appetite and entitlement. The pure vessel, Samuel, still needs instruction in the art and ethic of true listening.
Wow, that idea of prophecy itself being rooted in ethical attentiveness and shemi'ah, that feels like the perfect bridge to bring in our 20th century lens. Thinking about Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Yes, absolutely. Heschel, who is perhaps most famous for making the concept of divine pathos, God's deep emotional involvement in the world, God's vulnerability, God's feelings, making that absolutely central to understanding the mission of the prophets. He saw this narrative, the call of Samuel, as utterly fundamental.
So if the prophet is meant to be the voice of this divine pathos, how does Samuel's call specifically exemplify that for Heschel?
Well, Heschel argued quite powerfully that Samuel's narrative shows God breaking the divine silence not primarily to announce some abstract legal code or predict the distant future. No. God breaks the silence here, Heschel says, specifically to defend the abused worshiper, to stand up against the institutional abusers who are operating right there within the sanctuary, the very place meant for connection and solace. God feels the wrong being done, feels the injustice inflicted on the community because the priests, the designated intermediaries, have corrupted the sacred transaction for their own gain. So Samuel becomes the voice of the God who feels injustice, who demands right, who insists on internal accountability. The call is commissioned, you could say, specifically to critique cultic abuse happening inside Israel's own sanctuary. For Heschel, this anchors the prophet's role not just as a messenger, but as an ethical conscience, demanded by divine empathy, by divine feeling.
That really elevates the prophet's role, doesn't it? Beyond just politics or predictions, into being a moral and spiritual watchman for the community's integrity. And interestingly, centuries before Heschel, you mentioned Roches, the great French commentator from the 11th century, he used a simple visual cue from the text to highlight this very same contrast, didn't he, between purity and corruption?
Yes, he did. Rashi, known for his concise and insightful comments, he consistently points back to an earlier detail mentioned in the text, chapter 2, verse 18. It says, Samuel, even as a boy, ministered before the Lord wearing a linen ephod. Now, Rashi interprets this simple garment, the linen ephod, as the emblem of pure service. It's simple, unadorned, signifying availability, humility, and ritual purity. And he implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, contrasts this with the behavior of Eli's sons, their opulent living, their corrupt seizing of the best meat with that greedy fork, and their ultimate defilement of the sacred space. So you see, the entire narrative, when viewed through these lenses from medieval commentators like Rashi, right up to modern ethicists like Heschel, it's structured around these powerful literary and ethical polarities. Light versus dark, listening versus seizing, the pure white linen ephod versus the predatory metal fork. The contrast couldn't be starker.
Okay, so Samuel then delivers this absolutely devastating oracle to Eli, who, interestingly, accepts it quite stoically, almost resignedly. And from that point, the narrative seems to shift focus. It moves from the personal accountability of Eli and his sons towards the national consequences. The story wraps up this section by emphasizing how Samuel's credibility starts expanding nationwide. That's chapter 3, verse 20. And then you get that really pivotal line right at the start of chapter 4, verse 1a in many Bibles. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. The new order is established.
Yes, that expansion to all Israel is critical. It signifies that Samuel's authority isn't just replacing Eli locally at Shiloh. No, it's being recognized as a national mandate, effectively superseding the now corrupted centralized priesthood. And interestingly, textual criticism actually reinforces this theological claim. When you look at the variations between the different ancient manuscripts, for example, the Samuel text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, known as 4Q-Sen, that text often aligns more closely with the Old Greek translation, the Septuagint, LXX, than with the standard Hebrew Masoretic text, MT, in certain details. What this suggests to scholars is that throughout the period when these texts were being copied and transmitted, the story was something of a live tradition. It was still being shaped, perhaps, but the versions we have consistently solidified Samuel's national recognition and underscore the legitimacy of this transfer of authority away from the failed leadership at Shiloh.
Right. But the Deuteronomistic editors, the DTRH guys, shaping this whole narrative in their theological genius, they didn't just end the critique with Eli's sons, did they? They set up this really crucial, almost painful comparison later on. A comparison that ultimately justifies the people's eventual request for a king, because they show that the problem isn't just specific to priests or to Eli's family. It seems to be systemic to any kind of hereditary human leadership structure.
Exactly. This is the ultimate statecraft lesson embedded in the larger story arc. Remember Samuel, the prophet of purity, the one who condemned Eli's hereditary failure so powerfully. Well, later in the book of Samuel, when he himself is old, he appoints his own sons, Joel and Abijah, to serve as judges after him. And what happens? They fail too. The text is explicit. They exhibited a different but equally fatal form of corruption. They were turning aside after dishonest gain, they accepted bribes, and they perverted justice. That's 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 3.
Wow, so the pattern just repeats itself.
Right on.
It really drives home the point that the problem isn't merely theological related to the priesthood. It's deeply structural. Lineage apparently fails, regardless of the specific office, priest, or judge.
And the contrast in the specific nature of the corruption between the two sets of sons is highly instructive, probably intentionally so by the editors. Eli's sons, remember, their corruption was focused on cultic and sexual defilement within the sacred space. They corrupted the ziva, the sacrifice, an existential threat to the covenant relationship itself. Samuel's sons, on the other hand, their failure was in the civic sphere. It was judicial and economic corruption. They were civic judges taking bribes, twisting justice in the public square, undermining the rule of law.
So the corruption effectively moves from defiling the temple to defiling the courthouse, both equally damaging to the community, just in different spheres.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the narrative function of showing this recurrence, this repeated failure across generations and types of office, is almost certainly to prove the central thesis of the DTRH editors. Any hereditary system of leadership, whether priestly or judicial, that fails to prioritize merit, accountability, and genuine ethical integrity over bloodline or appointment, well, it's inherently unstable. It's destined to fail eventually. And this systemic critique of human authority, showing failure in both the priestly line and the prophetic judicial line, provides the final ethical justification in the narrative's logic for the people's subsequent demand for a king. They've seen 2 generations of non-monarchical hereditary leadership fail them. They're ready to try something else.
That adds such a layer of political realism to the text. And this profound institutional warning, it must have resonated deeply with historical figures who themselves lived through times of regime change and corruption. You mentioned Abarbanel earlier. Isaac Abravanel, the Iberian statesman and commentator from the 15th century, he focused on this, right?
Oh, absolutely. Abarbanel is a fascinating case. He wasn't just an armchair commentator, he was a high-ranking statesman, deeply involved in the politics of Spain and Portugal, and he wrote much of his commentary during or after the trauma of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. So he was acutely painfully aware of regime instability, political corruption, court intrigue, and the devastating consequences of institutional failure. When he read the story of Eli and Samuel, he framed Eli's downfall explicitly as a stark statecraft warning, a lesson for all political leaders, past and present. For him, the narrative pivot from corrupt priests to a charismatic prophet stepping into the breach, and then ultimately to the establishment of a monarchy, this was a logical sequence driven by political necessity. It proved, in his reading, that when the established cult officials start preying on the citizens they're meant to serve, the entire governing structure loses legitimacy and must be replaced by a new, divinely authorized channel of power. He saw real politic lessons in the text.
That makes the text feel so immediate, so political, not just like some ancient religious story. Okay, so finally, before we wrap up, we need to touch on the theological finality of the judgment. Not just against Eli's house, but against Shiloh itself, the place.
Right. For that deep theological reading, we can turn to Ramban Nachmanides, another giant of medieval commentary from the 13th century. He was both a master halachist, expert in Jewish law, and also a profound mystic. Ramban looked at the historical fact that Shiloh, after the events described around the capture of the Ark that followed this story, effectively ceased to be the central cultic place for Israel. It lost its status. And he interpreted this historical event theologically. He viewed the removal of Shiloh's efficacy, its sanctity, as prefiguring or perhaps embodying the concept of the Shekinah's withdrawal, the idea that the palpable divine presence itself departs from a sacred space that has been fundamentally desecrated by its own custodians.
That sounds like a principle of almost cosmic justice. What goes around comes around, but on a divine level.
It is very much like that. It connects to a core rabbinic principle known as midah keneged midah, which literally means measure for measure. The consequence mirrors the offense. If the priests chose greed and defilement over sanctity and service within the sacred space, then the divine sanctity itself ultimately chooses to leave those premises. It can no longer dwell there. And this theological interpretation by Ramban harmonizes perfectly, doesn't it, with that earlier divine decree back in chapter 3, verse 14, the one saying sacrifice and offering cannot cleanse this particular institutionalized desecration. The physical corruption of the cult, perpetrated by its leaders, leads inexorably to the metaphysical withdrawal of holiness from that place. The connection is broken from both sides.
Wow. So when you connect all these voices together from the ancient Aramaic Targum and the Talmudic sages, through medieval giants like Rambam, Rashi, Abarbanel, Ramban, right up to modern thinkers like Heschel, the core message of this story becomes incredibly clear and consistent, doesn't it? Corrupt, predatory leadership, especially within sacred or public institutions, inevitably forfeits its moral authority. And a pure, listening, ethically attentive servant, someone like Samuel, inherits that authority. The fall of Eli's house isn't fundamentally anti-priest or anti-institution. It's unequivocally anti-predation. And Samuel's rise represents the necessary triumph of conscience and ethical receptivity. #tag outro. So, okay, after weaving through all that, what does this all mean for us now? Sitting here today, it feels like the story we just told, especially when viewed through these 2 millennia of interpretive lenses. It provides this kind of permanent pedagogy, a timeless lesson about the true nature of leadership. Leadership, it seems, whether it's in ancient Shiloh or in any organization today, is fundamentally about custody.
It's about being entrusted with other people's offerings, whether literal sacrifices or their time, their money, their hopes, their trust.
Absolutely. And the verdict that echoes down through all these eras of interpretation remains stunningly consistent. Ziva just going through the ritual motions, the outward performance, the administrative function, if it's done without underlying justice, without integrity, without genuine care for those being served, it does not atone. It doesn't fix anything. And holding an office, having a title without conscience, without that ethical core, it simply does not last. The moral calculus, the story insists, is absolute, and it applies regardless of whether the corruption manifests as cultic abuse, like with Eli's sons, or as judicial bribery, like with Samuel's sons.
Yeah. And you can really see this powerful pedagogy, this lesson, being carried forward and applied right into the modern era, long after the physical context of Shiloh is gone. You take someone like Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, the hugely influential 19th century leader in Frankfurt, Germany. He looked at these chapters about the priesthood not as some obsolete piece of ancient history, but as being fundamentally about public trust. He essentially turned this chapter into a civics lesson for his modern community, stressing that integrity, meticulous service, and genuine attention to the needs of others must always precede and underpin any title or position of authority.
And similarly, you have Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi in British Mandatory Palestine, a major figure in 20th century religious Zionism and Jewish mysticism. Kook reframed this whole prophetic awakening, Samuel's call, not just as a past event, but as a kind of national template for spiritual repair, a recurring pattern. His view was that whenever established institutions become corroded, when they become deaf literally, fail to be shemi'ah to the needs of the people and the call of the divine, then revelation actively seeks out new vessels, vessels of purity, vessels capable of true listening. That concept of shemi'ah listening, ethical attention, receptivity it becomes, for Kook, the necessary vocation not just for individuals, but for moral and even national regeneration.
It really boils down to that, doesn't it? The power of this whole integrated story seems to pivot entirely on that fundamental shift, the shift from entitlement to attentiveness, from these grown men, priests, taking whatever they want with a fork, to a young child, Samuel, simply saying, Hineni, here I am, and then speak, for your servant is shemi'ah, I am listening. That posture, that willingness to listen and serve rather than seize and exploit, feels like the ultimate ethical requirement for all forms of leadership, always.
That really is the core takeaway. And perhaps just to leave you, the listener, with one final thought, connecting back to the broader historical context. We noted briefly that Samuel's call, the nocturnal setting, the divine commissioning of a servant, it shares some narrative traits with other ancient Near Eastern epiphany stories we know about things like King Gudea of Lagash's dream commissioning him to build a temple. These often happen at night, involve a divine message, and commission a task. But what makes the Israelite version, the story of Samuel, so uniquely powerful and so foundational to its ongoing ethical system? I think it's that Samuel is commissioned specifically to critique cultic abuse happening inside Israel's own central sanctuary. It irrevocably binds Israelite prophecy not just to predicting futures or endorsing kings, but fundamentally to ethical monotheism, to demanding accountability within the community, especially from its leaders. The divine light, the story suggests, often flares brightest precisely where the darkness of internal corruption is thickest, demanding attention and correction.